Welcome to my series on learning how to use 3D LUT Creator. Today we're going to be tackling the curves function in the software. Now, I suspect that most people watching this are already pretty comfortable using Photoshop curves, but just to make sure that everybody is on the same page, I do start the video with a 3 or 4 minute review of curves in Photoshop. Now, if you're already very comfortable with curves and you'd like to skip this part, you can just look down in the video description at the chapters. And instead of starting at the beginning, you can start with the chapter that's entitled, well, I haven't written it yet, but it'll be something like Differences in Curve Functionality Between 3D LUT Creator and Photoshop. Now, if you're new to this series and you'd like to see videos on some of the topics we've covered already, or even if you're someone that's been watching these videos regularly but would like to refresh your memory on some of the topics we've covered, I'm going to leave a link to the entire Learning 3D LUT Creator playlist up above. If you find content like this useful, I truly appreciate it if you consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button. Well, let's get to the video. Last week we tackled the rings used for color grading within the Curves tab. Today we're going to start working with the curves themselves. So I brought a photo here into 3D LUT Creator to work with. Let's go to the Curves tab and see what we've got. So at the top here, we have a special set of curves that are unique to 3D LUT Creator, which we'll be explaining in a few minutes. At the bottom here, we have a set of curves that functions very much like the Photoshop curves we know and love, except for a few minor functional differences that I'll mention. Now, I know that the vast majority of viewers watching this will likely know how curves work, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, I'm going to give a quick review, and it'll be helpful because when I'm reviewing this, I'm going to mention the functional differences between the 3D LUT Creator curves and the Photoshop curves in terms of usage. So on this master curve, the x-axis has the current brightness of all the pixels in the image indicated in histogram form from 0, the shadows, to 255, the brightest point. Now on the y-axis, we have the brightness of all the pixels that we can change the current pixel levels to. Now the line's at a 45-degree angle because at a 45-degree angle, any value on this line is the exact same on the x and y axis, and the reason for that is we haven't made any changes to the image using the curve. But now if we were to click and put a point on the curve and pull that point up, we can see here what has happened. The pixel with a value, brightness value of 102, which is the exact location on the line we chose, has now been lifted up to a value of 173. Because of the curve to the line, all the other pixels, save the endpoints, have also been increased in brightness, though not as much as the percentage-wise as the actual pixel that we lifted. Now, if we were to grab that pixel and pull it down, you'll see the image will have darkened, and the 126, I shifted a little to the right as I did it, because you can see as I shift one way or another, the starting value pixel that I am choosing is changed a little. Here it's 124, and that brightness value has shifted from 124 down to 42. And by the way, you can use your keyboard arrows to go left, right, up or down to make finer changes. Now, if we were to get rid of that, and if we were to put a point here and a point here, and make the lights brighter and the darks darker, we have the classic S-shaped curve, which is the adding of contrast to the image. I mean, in this case, it's too much, but I'm demonstrating the S-curve. And you can see that effect as I turn this master curve off and on to add the contrast back. Now I'm going to reset that curve. Now, just like Photoshop, if you use Photoshop curves, you know that buried in the Photoshop curve interface are separate curves for red, green, and blue channels. And we have the exact same here on the bottom, which, like I mentioned, is just like the Photoshop curves. So if we were to grab a point and pull up on the red channel, things become more red. The opposite of red is cyan. So if we pull down, things become more cyan. Green channel, if we were to put a point on and pull up, they become more green. Pull down, the opposite of green is magenta. Everything becomes more magenta. Blue channel, here's a point in the middle. Pull it up, everything becomes more blue. Pull it down, the opposite of blue is yellow, and we get a lot of yellow. Now, we also can decide that we want to make, for example, the shadows bluer and the highlights yellower. I mean, we do have control over where these changes on the channel curves go. So I am going to reset that. And I just wanted to show you, if we go to the master curve, that just as in Photoshop, using the targeted adjustment tool, we can come into the image and by moving our cursor around, see the brightness value on the curve of any point in the image. And we can, just like using the targeted adjustment tool in Photoshop, we can click to put a point on the curve and drag up or down, left or right, to make an adjustment. Let us reset. And now I did say that there were a couple of differences in functionality between the 3D LUT Creator curves and the Photoshop curves. So they don't really change anything about how the curves function or what they do, but they do affect how you use them or interact with them. So let me show you those very quickly. If we were to put a point on the curve and move it, in Photoshop, we would just drag that right off the curve and it would be gone and the curve would reset. Not so here. As you can see, if we just drag it off like this, we're not going to get anywhere. So there's two ways to remove the point that we put on a curve that we no longer want in 3D LUT Creator. The first is if we pull it off, we have to pull it all the way off into the image and then it's gone. Perhaps an easier way than that is to simply right-click on it and it's gone. Much easier. That's the first difference in functionality. Here's a second. If we have, for example, a curve and we want to change a segment of the curve to being straight as opposed to curved in terms of the changes we've made to it, in Photoshop, this would be a bit difficult. We'd have to put points in and pull the points around to try to get this area straight. And this is actually more useful in some of the other curves than a brightness curve. But just to show you how, on the brightness curve, if we hold down Shift and then click on that portion of the curve between the 2 points, it becomes straight. Now finally, on a Photoshop curve, we have an input and an output, and if we want very fine control, we can highlight and type in new numbers here. We can do the same thing in 3D LUT Creator, although it's done a bit differently. We have this point here selected. We can't just go over here. We made another point. You see, we can't just go over there and highlight it. What we have to do is hit Enter. When we hit Enter, we can go ahead and put the starting point and the change we want to make and hit Enter again to close that dialog. So those are some of the functional differences just in how you interact with these curves compared to Photoshop. Now I think I'm going to reset this, and it's going to be time to look at some of our special curves that we have up here. Okay, so first up is our Luminance Curve, the first one in the series of 4 special curves. So the interface looks a little different. We have this solid line, which looks very much like the line in the master curve, and we have this funny horizontal line. Well, some of these special curves use a 45-degree angle line like this as the baseline with no change, and others, as we'll see, use a horizontal line. Now, on this curve, the 45-degree angle line is perfectly solid, indicating that's the one in use. This horizontal line is dotted, indicating that's not the one in use on this curve, so we're just going to ignore this horizontal dotted line for the moment. In order to show what the luminosity curve does, we're going to have to return down here to the master curve for just a moment. And I'm going to put in that S curve that we used before to enhance contrast. But look what's happened. Not only did our contrast increase, but it's really wreaked some havoc with our colors, particularly here in the purples and in the greens, where it's markedly increased the saturation. Now, I'm going to turn that effect on and off for just a moment so you can see how it's made those saturation changes. Now, in some instances, we might want to have color changes along with an increase in contrast, but in this situation, we clearly don't. The luminosity curve functions just like the master curve, but it strips out those color changes and just applies the change in brightness that the curve dictates. So in this situation, it would enhance the contrast without giving us the color changes. Now, if there were a way to move this master curve up to the luminosity curve panel, you'd see what I mean. And as it happens, there is just such a way. If we come to this drop-down menu, we can swap the luminance and master curves. And I can do that back and forth a couple times, and you can see exactly what the difference is. So if I move this curve now up to the luminance curve, you'll see the contrast applied without the color change. Here we go. And if we go back once again, you'll see the color change along with the contrast. And we can make further changes depending on how much contrast we want. And again, it's affecting the contrast, but not changing the color. For Photoshop users, this is very similar to using the Photoshop Curves panel using the luminosity blend mode. So let's have a look at our next special curve, the SAT Luma Curve. So we'll come up here, click on this panel, and this is an interface that's totally unfamiliar to Photoshop users. So let's have a careful look at what's going on here. First of all, remember I had mentioned that the active line in a curve panel is solid. We'll come back to this in a moment. And that the dotted lines are indicative of the other panels, but not currently active. So with these dotted lines, we have the baseline of the SAT curve we haven't covered yet, and the changes that we've made to the luminance curves. Meanwhile, back on the SAT Luma panel, we have this straight line. What gives with that? Well, let's take a closer look, because the LumaSat curve and the SAT curve work in very much the same way with this horizontal line. So if we understand what's going on this panel, we'll understand the other two as well. All right, let's dive in and see what this graph represents. On the x-axis is luminosity or brightness. We can consider it the same thing, going from 0 to 255, just like on regular Photoshop curves. On the y-axis, we have saturation. So why is this line horizontal? Well, it's for a couple reasons. First, we're no longer comparing apples to apples. We're adjusting one image characteristic, saturation, based on a very different characteristic, luminosity. So, for example, if the line were at 45 degrees, it would mean that the brightest area of the image is also the most saturated, which is simply not true. So we need some kind of different indicator of the baseline unchanged state of saturation. Now, there's technical reasons why the baseline state is right in the middle of the y-axis, but I find it's much easier to simply think of this line as the baseline or unchanged saturation conditions, while anything above the line is becoming more saturated than baseline, and anything below it is becoming less saturated than baseline. With that knowledge, let's see how we can adjust image saturation based on brightness. So, the first thing I'm going to do here is to remind you that we can turn off the effect of the luminance curve, like so. On, off. I had just put it there to show what it can do, and obviously that contrast was too much. So, let's start by keeping things simple and just showing what happens when we move the endpoints. So, this is 0 on the x-axis, or the darkest area, and here we have 255, the brightest area. And this is our baseline saturation state. So let's look at the darker areas. We can get an idea of where those are. So these greens here are out here. But let's say we wanted to make those darker areas more saturated. Well, we could grab this point here and pull it up. And you can see how the dark areas became much more saturated. Likewise, we could pull them down and make them less saturated. Same with the brightest areas. The roof is sort of in the midtones. We have the walkway is sort of bright, and it has a blue tint to it. We can make that blue tint more saturated or remove saturation from it. So those are the endpoints. What if we just wanted to affect certain areas? For example, let's say we wanted to make this roof more saturated. We can click on it in the image. That applies a point here on the curve. We can take that point and lift it up, make the roof more saturated. Now, of course, we've made other areas in the brighter areas, as well as going into the midtones down to the shadows, a little more saturated as well. We can leave it that way. We can put other points in and try to take that saturation away. I can right-click on a point to remove it, and I can shift-click on a line segment to make it straight if I want. So what we've done here is, well, let me turn this off and on, and you'll see that we have saturated some of the lighter areas corresponding with this level of brightness. Now, somewhere along the line, you can see we've made this a little more saturated than we might want to. Again, we're not adjusting the color, we're adjusting the saturation based on the brightness, but I can put a point there by clicking, and I could pull that right back down to our baseline saturation. And now, let's turn it on and off. You can see that I've limited that saturation to really a very discrete area on that graph. And if I wanted to, I could add points like such and make it even, and I can straighten this by shift-clicking it and make it even more discrete in terms of what area is getting more saturated based on luminosity. So with that knowledge, I've reset the curve, and we can go back, for example, to our idea of desaturating the darks, knowing that we can add a point, pull it back up, shift click on the remainder of the curve, and now we can control how much of our darks are desaturated. You can see that effect here, and here it is off, and now with the desaturated on. Well, now it should be pretty easy for us to understand the remaining two special curves. So let's switch to the Luma Sat curve, and this is just the opposite from the Sat Luma curve. Before we start, we can see in the dotted lines the baseline Luminance Curve with the changes we've made. We can see the changes we've made on the Sat Luma curve. And here we have our horizontal line for the Luma Sat curve. What does this mean? Well, it's simply the inverse of the Sat Luma curve. Now we have saturation on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we have the parameter we're going to be adjusting. In this case, luminance or brightness. So now if we move a point on the horizontal line upwards, the brightness of the image at that level of saturation will increase. And if we move a point down, then the brightness at that level of saturation will decrease. Let's have a quick look. So now that we understand that, there's a lot of fun stuff we can do here. We can, this is our more saturated area here, and you can see on the graph up here where that lies in terms of saturation. We can put a point there. We can decide that we want to brighten those saturated areas. We can darken those saturated areas. We can, as before, decide we want to limit the area where we're changing the luminance based on saturation. We can do things like apply an S-curve for contrast based on saturation. For example, we might say we want to take the least saturated areas and make them brighter, and take the most saturated areas and make them darker. And we can see the effect that we've gotten there by making that move. So now let's go take a look at our final special curve. And as we go there, you will notice that I misspoke in my opening statements, because in fact the Sat curve, because we are comparing apples to apples, is a 45-degree line at baseline. So with this curve, we have the current saturation level on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we have the saturation level to which the input saturation will be adjusted to. Like with the luminance curve, at baseline the value of the points are both equal, but if we raise the indicated point, the saturation level that it correlates to will increase, and if we lower that point, the saturation level it correlates to will decrease. It's sort of like a super vibrance slider, in that the Photoshop vibrance slider allows us to pop the saturation of the less saturated colors, but we can do even more with this, as we can adjust the colors with any level of saturation we want to. Let's have a quick look. So for example, we could come here to our regions of lower saturation and pop that saturation up if we wanted to. These would be the regions of lower saturation. And then we've hypersaturated some of our other areas, and we can come right back and decrease that level of saturation. And here's our effect. And again, it's really something of a vibrance slider. We can make some fine adjustments to it. And again, I've overemphasized the degree of saturation you might want on this walkway, just to show the point of what one can do. Again, probably more reasonable is like that. But we can make fine adjustments to any area of saturation that we want to. So this was a bit of a longer video today, but I really wanted to make sure to try and explain how these special curves work and what they can do. Next week, maybe we'll take a look at how we might use some of these curves to add wanted effects to photos instead of just demonstrating what they can do. In addition, maybe we'll just take a short period of time and explain what some of these sneaky little drop-down menus can do as well. Well, we really covered a lot today, and I hope you found it useful. If you enjoy content like this, as always, I'd really appreciate it if you'd consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the like button. We'll see you next time.